So here's a story about how the hungry monster finds love. This is pitched as an opportunity to make a movie or possibly 10 to 12 episodes in a series, and this is 100% based on true life facts, and that life is mine. So the hungry monster, where did it come from? What does it mean? From the age of 3, in South Africa, in Gauteng, which was known as Johannesburg then, I was a toddler at home with a nanny whilst my dad worked full-time and my mom was in a morning's job. And the neighbor came across regularly. In that era there was apartheid in South Africa, so it was illegal for any relations between black or white, and the neighbor was white and my nanny was black, and he had come over to repeatedly rape her, and I was the toddler in the room because I was in her care. I couldn't be left outside. And I've had many different processes of healing around this, so I've seen more and more detail of what transpired. God has been amazing in showing me how to forgive myself for not protecting her, because the color of my skin in those days had far more power than the fact that she was older than me. But I was blackmailed into not saying anything, because if I did, he would have, number one, told my parents somehow that it was my fault. As a 3-year-old, I only believed him. I had no cognitive ability to question that it wasn't my fault. And number two, we had past rules in those days where any black person who was working in a white area had to have a specific set of papers in order to work in that area, and if they didn't have them up to date, then the police had these little yellow vans that they would cruise the streets with or in, and they would check the papers, and if someone didn't have the right papers, they would just literally lump them in the back and take them off to the cop station, and we never knew if we'd see them again. So when those vans came, you would just see a lot of the domestic workers in the area who were illegal in a sense, that didn't have their right papers, just running. So I knew this to be very real, and I was terrified. So based on those two threats, I never said a word. Then, as a comfort or as a coping mechanism, I basically took the words that I would have expressed, even as a little 3 to 4-year-old, with the ability to maybe say, "Mommy, there's an ugly man next door," or "Nanny's being hurt." I developed comfort eating. And this went on for, call it, the next 50 years. I'm 53 now. And I've been through many levels of, as I say, processes and healing, but it is something that is like a default. So it might not have been as bad now as it has been back then, but it certainly started building, and that's what I call the hungry monster. The beast that, from the brokenness inside of me, basically developed an appetite for comfort. And if you look at it, the mouth of a beast, it can get wider and wider, so it takes more and more to feed it. And the comfort eating got worse. Between the ages of 8 and 9, there were 3 different men who sexually abused me. And what I believe now in the spiritual realm is that some spiritual sex, call it, attached itself to me in a sense, because no one would find an 8 or 9-year-old attractive in my eyes. It just doesn't make sense. I still don't logically understand pedophiles, and I don't believe that the 3 different men were pedophiles. I just believe that they, maybe in the space that they were in, found something attractive about me. And many, many, many years later, through much research, even Oprah had a series on it, that if a 16-year-old girl fully developed did flick-flacks naked in front of a man, he still had no right to touch her. But I kind of had developed a belief, which was wrong believing, that it was my fault, and that, I obviously just had this something that men found attractive. As the the monster's appetite became bigger and bigger, it was very evident that I was attention seeking, because I had this deep lie that I was living in, or dark lie that I was living with. The pain became greater, so the monster's hunger became greater. And so I found attention that I got from performing, whether it was flirting or achieving. I was a top sports achiever from very young, winning the Victrix twice in primary school, twice in high school. I was very good at academics. I was also a dancer and was dancing on television from about the age of 5 to 13. Then I became a model and a beauty pageant winner, so I got a lot of attention. But what I think a lot of people relate to as a hole inside of me just got bigger and bigger. So eventually, from about 14, I became a binge drinker, and then at 22, a little bit, but quite profoundly at 25, started dabbling with drugs. And so by the age of 38, I landed up very broken. Actually, yeah, I was 38. I landed up broken in a rehabilitation center. And what had happened in my late 20s is I had got married for a very brief period to a wonderful man. The challenges within our marriage, though, were he also had some things that he hadn't necessarily dealt with as a child, and came from a divorced home. And so there was this understanding that from his part, a physical relationship wasn't actually that necessary in a relationship, and I was okay with that. But I deeply was seeking affection, and by not getting the affection, or the misunderstanding that my desire for affection was that I was actually wanting something more, which in a sense I had a right to. I was married. There was just lots and lots of rejection, and at that stage we were both incredibly well groomed, and he was a dancer, so was I. He actually danced for the South African Chippendales. I had danced in a beauty stroke Queen of Clubs dance championship, won for South Africa and came third in the world in Singapore. And obviously I had the modeling and the beauty pageants on the side, so there was a lot of vanity in the center of everything that we did. And I can only really speak for myself, but we were together for 4 years. For the 2 years of marriage, my vanity just got bigger and bigger, because I thought, well, if there's something wrong with me, then let me see what I can do to improve that. Anyway, the marriage fell apart after 2 years, and he immigrated, and I, very, very broken, rejected, worthless, landed up very quickly getting into a relationship with someone that he actually had been training a gym with, who'd been quite a good friend of the two of us. The three of us, maybe in the preceding 6 to 8 months, had spent a lot of time together, and this guy basically said what I'd been craving to hear, that I was amazing, that he'd sort of loved me from afar. And very quickly I allowed him to move in with me. The divorce was through a few weeks, and this basically set up a 3-year very toxic relationship. I knew after a few months that I'd made a mistake, but being very broken at that point, I struggled, and I didn't really have, where I was living in Johannesburg at the time, much of a family network to help me make some good solid decisions to help ask him to move out. And so 3 years later, I only landed up through lawyers being able to get an eviction notice that we had come to an agreement that he would leave, and I paid quite a hefty sum of money as a settlement, because by that stage he had claimed a common law husband position, and I, to be honest, didn't argue it. I was just hoping to get my freedom. And the reason why it was so imperative that we separated was, in that 3-year space I had been introduced to what they called house parties in those days, and I'd really struggled with the fact that there was just always an availability of ecstasy, a few other drugs, but mostly I was afraid of of a lot of them. So, but ecstasy, taken in copious amounts, say from like a Friday to a Sunday. By Tuesday, they call it the come down Tuesday, and I would be feeling very, very suicidal. And so I think from the marriage and this very toxic relationship, the suicidal thoughts had become second nature to me. I lived with them. It was not uncommon for me in one day to think about different options. And all I can say is, by the grace of God, I never lived in a home that had a lock-up garage, because from what I'd seen on movies, etc., that was probably one of the most guaranteed ways to be successful, because I didn't want to be a suicide attempt. If I was going to do it, I wanted to be sure that I did a good job of it, and wasn't ever resuscitated in a sense, and it kept me obsessed. I did have a massive fear though of failing and then having to deal with the consequences. The shame of it was just, I didn't want to disappoint my family any more than I already had. And so I took a gap year and I went overseas to a family where I was able for a year to look after a 2.5-year-old. It was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in this little 2.5-year-old's almost like struggle with his parents both working and being traveling a lot, and me being broken from everything, since the age of 3, and at this stage I was 34. We had this incredible unconditional love experience, and it was just awesome. And in that time I chose, after 18 years of bulimia, because with all this comfort eating, you can imagine someone who was trying to hold beauty pageant titles and modeling contracts, I needed to stay slim. So the only way I could stay slim was to become bulimic, and I didn't vomit for very long, because it's the most appalling thing as anybody would relate to. I just used laxatives, which I still today struggle with the consequences of that, being gluten and dairy intolerant. But I decided that year, that's it. Whatever goes in, stays in. And the consequence was I put on 17 kilograms. And I remember using my sister-in-law's maternity clothing, because I was struggling, to find any clothes that fit. When I came back to South Africa, I remember almost being laughed at by the same guys that always used to find me physically attractive. And so I decided, well, I'm starting from scratch now. I have to build a career, find a place to live, etc. And I joined, I didn't have money to join a gym, so I started just walking, and managed to do that exercise in a lunchtime every day, and tried to watch what I ate. And I very, very quickly managed to lose the weight, and next thing I was now a Johannesburg party socialite, and got into one toxic relationship after another, because nothing had been dealt with in terms of the brokenness, right? It didn't go away. It just plastered over with some research that I'd done in America. I'd started studying meditation and got into religious science. It's not Scientology, but it's slightly the same, but not really. It's more the principle of affirmation and the law of attraction and that kind of thing, as opposed to believing in aliens. So then I was now in South Africa, 35, and I'd gotten back to all of my stuff being stolen out of storage downtown Johannesburg, and I had to start all over again. So I slowly built everything up, but by the age of 37, going into my 38th birthday, which was the start of 2008, I had really gotten into a very, very dark place. I was drinking and drugging way too much, and had even got to the point of complete delusion. There's a lot to be said for how the mind creates, as I say, an illusion of how I finally could become accepted, because I'd been subjected to my most recent toxic relationship at that time, there was a lot of domestic violence. I'd been quite badly injured and verbally abused and physically and sexually abused. So I'd seen what had been going on in the strip clubs because I'd been taken there a few times. These guys at that stage that I'd been hanging out with were pretty much gangsters, and they did a lot of their business in the strip clubs. Sorry, there's an aeroplane flying over, and I'm not sure if you will be able to hear. Oh, it's 4 helicopters. Must be some kind of crime, something. I live in South Africa where we're going through a lot of issues at the moment. Anyway, so I had decided to join some of the women that I'd been hanging out with to go and dance at a very prestigious strip club for 2 months here in Johannesburg, which was where a lot of celebrities and very wealthy men vacated. It had one of the best restaurants in the area, and I had my eyes opened up to a whole nother world. And at 11 o'clock on a Monday morning, a lot of married men would arrive. They would just sit and have coffees and then lunches and drinks with us and chat, and we'd get paid by the hour. I never ever danced on a open public table. I only went upstairs to the private lounges. I'd approached the producer of Carte Blanche at the time, and I'd said to him, doesn't he want me to do a docudrama where I could take hidden cameras with me undercover, and we could go and, just get some insight into what actually goes on there. I wanted to interview some of the other girls to find out why they were there, interview the bouncers, and maybe even interview some of the men frequenting the place. Anyway, they did agree, and they sent me a contract, but the contract included the fact that I'd have to also be dancing on the footage. And there was just a part of me, I knew I was like a Mary Poppins that had got caught up in the very, very wrong, toxic place, and I don't know how, but I just knew something would have to get me out of there, and I could not just take that next step. In fact, on the day that I had the meeting where we were going to sign everything and I would get started with the filming, I landed up being so wasted that I just didn't make the interview. So in a way, I was protected from something that might have had an untold damaging effect on my life. And before I knew it, I had a young man living with me. He was 14 years younger than me, who was a hardened mainlining crystal meth addict, and I would supposedly have to go to the club whilst he had these parties at my house, and then I'd bring the women and their followers, boyfriends, whatever, back with me. And it was just the most horrific. It was like being in Sodom and Gomorrah, and I was terrified. And that was when I was like, okay, now the only way I can get out of this is to literally run in front of the biggest, fastest moving Putco bus or something, because it was just awful. And then this very amazing young man said to me one day, Aldine, that's the most selfish thing you could ever do, because you'd be gone and you'd leave the rest of us to grieve you. And that man, between 3 and 6 months later, actually landed up killing himself. So I'm just so grateful to him, because he gave me the responsibility and the accountability to not impose that onto friends and family. So I landed up escorting this young guy that was living with me down to rehab in the beginning of April 2008. And on the plane, he'd said to me, babe, please come with me. You have to come with me. I can't do this on my own. And I said to him, well, okay. Then I thought, great idea, because then I could keep an eye on him and make sure that he didn't cheat on me, because there'd been lots of infidelity and craziness going on in those, it was like 3 months, 3.5, 4 months. So I agreed, and I remember reading a Cosmopolitan on that airplane and reading about a specialist psychiatrist who dealt with suicide, cases, people that were maybe thinking about it or had tried it, but obviously hadn't succeeded. His name was Dr. Schlebusch, and he worked out of Entebbe, and I landed up actually going to see him, and he just said to me, look, there's a lot of brokenness in my life, and there'd been a rehab that had been suggested inland from Scottsboro, and it was different to the place where my boyfriend at the time was going, because that particular rehab said there's no ways they're going to let me come and stay there. He'll never get well. And they weren't even 100% sure that I was an addict. Partying and, being a bit wild is not addiction. So this psychiatrist basically said he thought I should go and just get well in a rehabilitation facility. And I just thought, well, great. Maybe I can spend those 3 months writing a book. I cashed in a retirement policy so that I had money to pay the 50 grand that was required, and off I went, much to the horror and shame of my family, because I was a child that was destined for greatness. Anyone who knew me to be a deputy head girl in primary school, a head girl in high school, a valedictorian. So what the heck, I was Miss Durban when I was 24. How the hell did this land up being my life? Scarred by domestic violence and all I'd seen and all I'd done. There was just so much self-loathing and hatred. Anyway, by the time I got to the rehab, there was no going back. I'd paid the 50 grand in advance, and they were hectic. I was there for 3 months, and they took us off to every kind of 12-step meeting, Alcoholics Anonymous, Drug Addicts Anonymous. I then got involved in Overeaters Anonymous, Eating Disorders Anonymous, and Bulimic and Anorexics Anonymous. And I did that for 6.5 years. But I wasn't getting well, because one thing was very starkly missing. And when I was 44, I landed up, it was actually when I was 43. My dad had just been admitted into a home. He had vascular dementia, and I'd been going down to Scottsboro for many years to be there for him and my mom. And then eventually, when he went into the home, I'd go down and stay, sometimes from a Friday, sometimes Saturday morning through to often Sunday, or sometimes even Monday morning, to support and visit him and just be there. My siblings were both overseas, so this was sort of a pattern I'd gotten into, that I just knew that this is what I needed to do. And there was an element of comfort in it, but there was a lot of I was not living my life. I wasn't opening myself up to dating or to being with anyone. And to be honest, I can see there was a level of protection that God had over me, because I really wasn't healed. It doesn't matter how much older you get. It doesn't mean that age or life experience just cures all of the madness. And rehab had gotten to the bottom of a lot of resentments and anger that had been held against. In fact, mostly resentments. I kind of didn't really think I was too much of an angry person. I never was one to have angry outbursts, etc. There'd been 1 or 2 during the drugging or drinking, which obviously was fueled by chemical toxicity, but it wasn't in my nature. I was very passive and sort of calm like my dad. And now I found myself stuck in a place where I was exposed to a whole lot of criminals, drug addicts, people that had stolen and had murdered and had taken their partners or their children for granted, had used college funds or university savings or even baby food to go and buy their fix. And I didn't relate to it. I related to the obsession of needing, for me, was food. But food wasn't going to kill really me. I wasn't ever obese, and it certainly wasn't harming anyone else in the process. Maybe the fact that I embarrassed my family, that was harm. But I was the product of my childhood. I didn't ever plan to become a woman in a domestic violent relationship living the most insane life. It's just how life unfolded. So when I came out of rehab, it was really hard to try and rebuild myself up. I stuttered. I was very starting to get very overweight because I hadn't, I wasn't bulimic anymore. I was still just overeating. And in rehab, I did a lot of comfort eating because they were quite horrible to me. They, they use sort of like beat the dishonesty and manipulation out of you, and I'd come to understand that flirtation was a manipulation, and I'd use that to get the attention I so desperately craved. And obviously it was always in the wrong places, which is why I landed up in the wrong kind of relationships. And so now I started working in Scottsboro, landed up being able to finally get a job in Durban, and spent a good 15, just call it 14 years, slowly but surely trying to get my career back on track. I'd almost sabotaged my career. At 28, I was a shareholder and director in an ad agency, and here I found myself fast forwarding to 43, and I'd had jobs. And once my dad had gone into the home, 4 days later I was in Glenwood where I was living, and a friend of mine and I got hijacked by 5 men with guns, and I was really badly injured. She wasn't. The car was totally trashed. It was maybe 10-15 minutes of high-end thriller movie style madness. And when I came out of hospital, I had a broken arm, a broken wrist, a head injury. I went on to, kind of just cope. I had this mask of composure I'd put on my whole life since that age of 3. And I was doing service at the prison because I carried on in NA for quite a while. And I had set up a 12-step program in the ladies' prison at Westville. And I was busy sharing with the ladies, and suddenly I started crying, and I could not stop. It was horrendous. And that mask of composure fell off, and it was a great moment in that the real Aldine had to be revealed to the world. But it was terrifying because that mask of composure helped me to cope. Now here I was sharing for my 6-year milestone, and people were saying for the first time, it's so great to meet Aldine. There was no more of this acting and sort of high performance. This was the real raw deal, and it was awful, but at the same time absolutely brilliant. And a few months down, after this incident at the prison with the crying, someone said to me, Aldine, you need to get some help. I'd been for 1-hour trauma counseling after the incident, and it was suggested to go to the church in Florida Road in Durban for some counseling. And so I agreed, because at that stage I was a practicing Buddhist. I'd gone from all the new age law of attraction vibes into Buddhism because I'd started going to meditation classes. And I just remember walking in to the church saying, hey pastor, great to meet you, you can counsel me, but don't mention the J word. I'll pause it there and carry on a bit later.